welcome everybody to another edition of Photon Insiders. As you know, we have released recently the BR200 project on the Asset Store. And last week, in our first part of the Postmortem, we have spoken about what it took to get it developed with Fusion. But as we already mentioned last time, a Battle Royale game can't be competitive unless you host the actual game session on a dedicated server. Joining me today to explore this topic is Jiri, who you already know as the lead dev on Fusion BR. And as a special guest today, we have also Dan Richards from Multiplay joining us.
Hey folks, good to be here.
So, before we dive into this topic a bit further, Dan, how about you tell our viewers a bit about yourself and what you do over at Multiplay?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, my name's Dan. I'm one of the staff engineers over at Unity. So I work in the multiplayer suite. And what that means is I work with the engineering teams across a few products. So Multiplay game server hosting, Unity Matchmaker, and our relay and lobby services as well. So I work a lot with those groups, and we had a great collaboration with Tim and Jiri and the team to put together the Fusion BR sample and integrate that with Unity gaming services.
Well, awesome. Thank you very much. So, as we all know, especially anyone here that works on software and engineering, there's one very important thing to do when you first start using something new, and that is start simple. So Dan, how did you and your team go about exploring Fusion and how it might tie into Matchmaker and Multiplay?
Yeah, great question. I mean, ultimately, where we started from was the docs and the sample code that was available with Fusion already. So we started with one of those sample projects, and we took a look at that and said to ourselves, okay, what is Fusion giving us out of the box? What cloud services are available on the Photon side already, and how do they compare and contrast with what we offer in UGS? And if I share my screen very briefly, I'll show you what I mean by that. So Tim, is that displaying correctly?
Yes.
Awesome,
yes.
Thank you.
No, we can't.
Yes.
All right, cool. So yeah, we started out in this world of, as I say, comparing and contrasting Multiplay Unity gaming services with Photon, and we came to this situation whereby I've got situations like you've got the lobbies service, the sessions system within Photon already, which is allowing folks to do that sort of server discovery, server browser, all sort of initial level matchmaking. And we wanted to say to ourselves, how do we get that hooked up with dedicated servers hosting out on Multiplay? Now, Multiplay's bringing to the mix there is we can spin up servers across a number of cloud providers. We've got 200 bare metal data centers there as well, which we can start bringing into the mix as well. How do we get folks running a Photon Fusion game connected to those servers on the Multiplay side? And what we did to start with is we built a really basic proof of concept. We took one of the sample titles, the sample projects, deployed that into Multiplay in a dedicated server build, and initially just ran it vanilla Photon Fusion out of the box and used the simple sort of server browser to get those players connected. And then our sort of next step was, how do we start doing this at a bigger scale of players, right? How do you start thinking about advanced matchmaking here? How do we start thinking about different queues of players, different game modes, different sort of rules, and almost like sort of skill-based matchmaking, things like that as well, which is where we sort of evolved to a model a little bit like this. So pretty similar to what I showed you before, but we introduced this concept of a shared match ID. So in the middle here, this extra component is the Unity Matchmaker. So what we were able to do there is use Unity Matchmaker's existing integration with Multiplay to allocate game servers on demand. So at this point, Unity Matchmaker is going to take a request from a group of players, a matchmaker ticket. We've got 20 people, 200 people who want to play a Battle Royale match together. They send a ticket into the matchmaker. Matchmaker says to Multiplay, hey, I need a game server. These people are in this particular region. Maybe they're in North America. Maybe they're in North America West, something like that. And we're going to spin up a game server, which is called an allocation, and we're fanning out this match ID in two directions. So a unique ID for that match. The player game clients get given that ID. The game server gets given that ID. And that allows us to then use the existing discovery mechanisms that are in Fusion, within Photon, within Lobby, within the session system, to then bring those folks together. And all of that to say is we then have got a quick play button where those folks spinning up their game title just hit quick play, and Matchmaker and Multiplay did that heavy lifting of spinning up a dedicated server and bringing all those people together. And that's ultimately what we did in the proof of concept initially, and is the underlying sort of integration piece in BR200.
Yeah, I already see the next investment call coming. Oh, but just add the quick play button. And then every engineer is going to go, no! I already see that happening here. But I think you showed very well, like that is the key aspect, right? Is that there are different concepts involved here. You have the actual game session running on the game server, or commonly called the dedicated server. Then the actual session, which is the concept of rooms, as some other texts call it, where the players are held, the information can be shared between those. And then you need to connect these two parts for the players to not only be in the same room, but then, of course, play in the same game session on the dedicated server. And I reckon you, of course, didn't start by integrating all of that immediately into BR200, did you? Did you?
Yes, I started with a very simple game of moving a white box just around a plain green field. The simple starter project that I guess anybody works with. And full disclosure, I'm not a game developer. I am awful at doing game development. I'm a services guy, so I make the most simple box moving around a map thing that I could, and got that integrated with the services.
To be fair, that's even how we've seen developers from AAA studios with years and years of experience start with any technology, even ours, whether it's Fusion, Quantum, or the older ones. So what you did here is exactly how any game developer would have had to start, regardless of their level of expertise. It's not how any of us want to start, but that is how you learn.
Yes, very true.
So, of course, this simple green field was not enough to build it in. What was like the next step from this proof of concept over to integrating it into something as fully fledged as BR200 already was at that point?
Yes, I think our sort of next evolution of that was, how do we do this at a scale that BR200 is realistically going, is designed to cope with, right? Like a greenfield like that, or the sort of basic integration wasn't going to be workable for the sort of player counts we were thinking about dealing with there. And that's where myself and the other staff engineers, worked very closely with Jiri and the team to start sort of benchmarking what kind of performance can we get from Fusion and BR200 on multiplayer. How can we get it to this 200 players, 60 hertz? And what is our sort of raw level of performance, and what kind of optimizations do we do on the server side? Optimizations do we do on the multiplayer side to start building this out to where we knew it could all get to? So that was our sort of next big step, I think.
Yeah, and I think, well, speaking of testing, right, once you have it running, you need to test it. And Jiri, you worked on some quite interesting tooling to get all of these, 200 players into a session. How did the tooling have to evolve compared to what we had originally, and then to facilitate that on an integration like the one Dan and the team worked on?
Yeah, so because we already tested locally the performance of the server, we were already partially prepared to test also multiplayer machines. We were somehow prepared because we had support for running a headless dedicated server. So it was just the point that we should support only the API provided by Multiplay and just add it to the pipeline, and I can show you how the performance was analyzed.
Ooh, more graphics.
Yeah.
Well, in this case, quite literally a graphic.
I do love a good
I will
graph.
share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see it already.
Okay, so what you see is actually an HTML graph. It's a recorded session on the bare metal server, which is hosted by Multiplay. It's the most powerful we got, and you can see the blue line, which is raising its player count, and it's raising up to the 200 players. And if we focus on this part of the graph, the red line is delta time of the engine, and you can see most of the time we are below 15 milliseconds with several peaks above, which means on these peaks we couldn't reach 60 hertz, but most of the time we are within the 60 hertz, and we can call it's a stable simulation.
Yeah, I mean, there will always be
Yes.
unavoidable peaks, right? I mean, after all, I mean, these are 200 players. There's absolutely no way you can predict all scenarios of
Yeah.
how they will congregate or whatever they will do in the
And
actual
it's
game.
already with some simulated input. I picked quite high threshold where players are randomly shooting and making really big traffic. So the server is quite stressed, and this don't even need to happen in a real game. So yeah, so this is the tooling we are using for testing. It doesn't have to be analyzed real time. We can just take these these data and post-process. We can make some reporters which will check how the game perform and inform us about, let's say, performance regression from version to version and so on. Okay.
Right. So, of course, in this case, we quite literally added the multiplayer integration on top of an existing game. So, what was your experience then in doing that after the fact, essentially? Because I mean, the game was there, right? It was not in development anymore. I mean, aside from the obvious bug fixes and optimizations, but all the core loop was there. So what was your experience on that front?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I give a slightly biased answer to this just because I've seen behind this, behind the curtains with Multiplay. I know a lot of where the guts of the system are, but that aside, I think the experience was actually from our point of view and somewhat a bit of a sales pitch now, in so much that we launched a software development kit for Multiplay for Unity game in particular, and that actually made this a super easy process because we were able to take the existing build of BR200, drop in our Multiplay game server SDK, and sort of became a turnkey process. Like we had an integration there with the Matchmaker and the allocations lifecycle already. We were able to start tricks out of BR200 as well into the Unity ecosystem, into the dashboard ecosystem. I think where we probably had a few more challenges was enabling things such as like backfill and the sort of more nitty-gritty Matchmaker integration piece. I think we ran into a few challenges there, but generally it's a pretty smooth process from my point of view.
I mean, I think this is really the important aspect, right? Because, well, I mean, generally speaking, we're not advising anybody to add multiplayer as in from scratch to an already developed game. The important part, and I think you'll concur, Dan, is this worked because it was built in a client server mentality. If it hadn't been, the process probably would have been a whole lot more complicated.
Yes. Yeah, it's a fair assessment.
So kind of just to reiterate some of the things we've already, told on multiple occasions is start with client server. You can do that in player hosted, and once you know that your game is ready, you can go directly then and integrate an SDK like the ones from Multiplay to actually then have the game sessions run on the dedicated server. Just add complexity, bit by bit. This is maybe the good point for you, Jiri, to jump back in. Player hosted or dedicated server first. I know we've had that conversation a few times, but you had a very interesting take on it that it's not always clear. So
yeah, it's good definitely to start with the player hosted solution because you have the immediate visual response. You can check stuff, but it's also very important to start with the dedicated server and the full press, let's say, the full amount of players, like in our case 200, and to start early with the pressure testing and
So in short, start with the one that you will need when you first launch. So if you're doing an esports title, your main goal will be to have dedicated servers for security and fairness. And if let's for example say Counter-Strike, you also have community games after the fact. You can have those being player hosted because you might not need that same restrictions you have on ranked matches. But somebody mentioned Valheim before. Here you might want to go player hosted first and then evolve that into something that might be hosted on a dedicated server for those players that do want to have that continuously running world, regardless of who is connected. So either approach is valid. The question is not which one is better, but which one is most suitable to your specific project based on the design goals and the audience that you do have for the gameplay type that you ultimately want to build. Now, where do we go from here? I mean, the core loop was there, right? And to me, it sounds, and that's probably something I would love for the two of you to correct me, but it almost sounded effortless, which I know for a fact it wasn't. So do you want to maybe tell us a bit more about, the learnings that you had about doing this integration and maybe some of the preconceptions that you had to walk back to revisit with a better solution or, fresh eyes to see, okay, this is actually how we should have done it?
If I might start,
please,
to review the integration process. Although there were a lot of bugs and fixes we had to do in either our code or the Multiplay SDK and so on, I was kind of surprised how smooth was the initial integration into the project. So that was really a big surprise for me. So,
well, that's very good to hear. I think between Jiri and ourselves, we did run into a few challenges with the I think initial sort of instance sizes we had available in Multiplay. I think we initially benched it on a few cloud virtual machines, and ultimately 200 players, it needs capable hardware behind it, and I think we went back and forth on a few different VM types before we ultimately settled on let's actually do this properly and send some bare metal in that direction to really get the performance.
Yeah, I mean, this is also a very good point that both of you addressed. Like the hardware that you need, it doesn't depend on what you want to do, but what you actually need to do. Like something like BR200, and I think this was why this cooperation was perfect at the time that it came together, is we had something that was stress testing servers, and you wanted to say to which end can we push all of these different settings that we have. And so, every time you explore the edge of what's possible, you will inevitably run into unknowns because it's literally the first time you've encountered that.
Yeah, Absolutely, and and there's so many variables to consider there as well when you are thinking about hosting dedicated servers. It is the numbers of players per match, it's the numbers of instances of servers you can fit on a given piece of hardware, the length of your match, that kind of thing. You may find that sort of conversely, something like BR200, which is going to be a relatively long match length, is easier to host in some ways than a game that might have a match length of 2 minutes with 4v4. If you're constantly churning through servers and allocations and matchmaker tickets, you might find in some cases that's more difficult. So yeah, huge amounts of variables to consider there.
That's true. I mean, again, and that is why it's always difficult to give generic advice, right? Because every game, every design, every project is almost too unique to really say blatantly, okay, this is how you do it and you always do it. Most of the time it's like, that's how you do it. Now let's see how this needs to be tweaked and adjusted to what you need to build. Well, we got a question coming on here. It's coming from Eric. So any advice or words on how you suggest the community to adopt multiplay, whether it's examples for small studios and indies, or well, let's call them not so small AAA studios. How does the process differ? And is there something that you would recommend for them to jump early on in dedicated servers and queue-based matchmaking when they plan for their actual development?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think this speaks to the way that Multiplay is evolving as a business inside Unity Gaming Services. We've got sort of two halves of the business, right? We've got the enterprise piece of the business, which has been around for a number of years and dealt with some pretty big AAA titles and studios. But now we're moving to this world where we want to take those sort of years of experience and bring it to people at their fingertips, right? So to your point, Tim, on the sort of indies, maybe the AA studios, if I can use that term, my advice at that point is just get involved, get started, start playing around with samples like BR200, and Multiplay is there with a certain amount of credit to get started with. So that our goal is to get people into the ecosystem to start trying these things out for themselves and just experiment with dedicated servers more than anything. And we don't think that's necessarily going to be limited to these smaller studios. It also allows folks to sort of try before they buy. Like if you want to get into a long-term hosting contract for a big title, for a AAA title, you want to make sure you're investing your game, you're investing your time into a solution that's going to be right for you. So we think actually having self-serve and the way Multiplay is today as a sort of adoption vector in that route as well is going to be super interesting. But as I say, UGS, it's not just about dedicated servers. We've got Matchmaker in there as well, and that is also a self-service product alongside Multiplay. So we've got now stuff like BR200 to demonstrate the ways in which you can create the sort of rule-based matchmaking with backfill, with custom data query and custom data logic in there as well for skill-based or rolling out cheaters or things like that as well. And there's even peer-to-peer support in UGS as well. So a long answer to say there's free credits. Just come and try stuff out, basically.
Yes, I think that is probably the, the short version of it. So, well, we got another question here that comes in. So, the Unity matchmaking, if a player issues a ticket, or rather requests a ticket, and then establish a connection to the match, how is the flow as far as, well, requesting the data from the player and what they get back to eventually end up in the match they should? Is there any simple version you can use here to explain that?
Yeah, for sure. So the simple version of that is, let's think about it as tickets. So everybody with their game client on their PC or their console, they'll generate a matchmaking ticket when they hit quick play. I want to play Battle Royale. I'm in London. This is my current BR200 skill level. Send that ticket into the matchmaking queue, and then the matchmaker's job is to pull together those tickets from similarly located, similarly skilled, and folks who want to play the same game mode, and those go into a queue. and Matchmaker's job is then to get enough people together to place on a server, and it talks to Multiplay, gets a server to fulfill that match for all those tickets, and then ultimately the game client will get back an IP and they'll get back a port or the connection details or just some way of establishing that connection to the game server. And what the really cool thing we can do with Matchmaker is we can have multiple different queues for different types of game mode. So deathmatch players go here, BR players go here. And within those queues, we can actually have different pools as well. So maybe you want your beta testers to go off to a different set of servers. Maybe you've got a game mode over here that supports backfill, so you want a slightly different pool there. You've got a cheating problem or something. You want to go put all your cheaters on the same server so they can annoy each other. There's stuff you can do with Matchmaker as well.
So, I mean, that's fantastic. Eric put in some more details. So essentially, is the connection pole-based or stateful? As in, when the information, or rather the result of the ticket is delivered to the game client, does the game client have to keep asking the service, or is it delivered over an established connection?
Oh, now that is a fantastic question that I don't have the answer for off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure that it is pole-based, but I will have to refer you to our Matchmaker documentation on that.
You know, the famous RTFM. This is true for anything that's complicated. You will unfortunately not get around reading some of the docs as you go along. This is true for Multiplay. It's true for Fusion and any other heavily advanced tech.
And don't forget, the manual can be different than the actual code.
Yes. All right. So, as we move on from this particular point, is there anything that you would, give people as a, the key advice if they wanted to go down the road of dedicated service with Multiplay with a technology like Fusion? What is the one thing they and their team should think about as they are planning and preparing to go into such a production?
I think I would give two pieces of advice there. I think one is think hard about capacity planning and where you want to host those game servers. So have a real think about where you think your players are going to be and what kinds of game modes those folks are going to be interested in, because ultimately that is what's going to drive the placement of your game servers, and it's also going to derive the model in which they scale. Because one of the things that the enterprise Multiplay product does is you can burst between bare metal and cloud servers. So you want to be able to optimize your hosting for A, cost, and B, performance, right? So you don't want to be bursting into cloud too much because it's going to cost you a lot of money at the end of the day. But equally, you don't want to commit to a huge amount of bare metal to just fix server hosting if it's going to be unused. So yeah, point one is capacity planning is going to be super important, and also have a real good think about the reality of server placement. And what I mean by that is, you're unlikely to be in a situation where you've got a physical machine or a virtual machine that's just got one instance of your game server on it. It's a pretty inefficient way of running your model. So you're going to be thinking about running multiple instances of your game server process alongside each other. So I think that's a piece of advice I'd give as well, making sure that that model works pretty well. Port binding is going to work the way you expect it to. Your sort of log shipping and standard out of the game server is not going to conflict with each other, that sort of stuff.
All very important parts. And Jiri, anything that you have to add to what Dan said as far as, building games in dedicated server mode with Fusion in order to make sure that once you're ready, you can integrate Multiplay as simple as as it happened to be with BR200?
Yeah, well, just check the sample and that's it. You will see.
Do like we did.
Yeah,
it's simple.
Exactly.
When you know what you do.
It's quite simple. It's just a few scripts and yeah, nothing really
If I may come back to the earlier question, it is poll-based. So the game client would continue polling the matchmaker with the ticket ID until it gets the result back.
Well, there you go. Thank you. Right, so we got another question that's been recurring in the community here, and that is, given the early stages now of multiplay and self-serve, what is the best channel to get support on these particular points as they keep exploring at this point in time?
Yeah, for sure. So the best point for that, I would say, would be the Unity forum. So we've got a dedicated forum set up for Unity Gaming Services and all the services within that, so Multiplay, Matchmaker, and the others as well. So that is being constantly manned by our developer support team, by our account managers, and you'll even see me and some of the engineers pop up in there pretty often as well. So that's your sort of best point to get real quick answers on the product. And there is a support process in the dashboard as well, but I would suggest forum is the best place to go, because ultimately you'll probably find another game developers asked the same question and got the answer you need, and if not, we'll be there to help you.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear that you guys, even at the engineering level, are that involved. That is not always easy to do, is it?
No, definitely, and I think that speaks to the way that Multiplay's evolved as a business over a number of years. Like, we started out as a really small team, like maybe 5 or 6 people in the UK. I imagine the Photon folks probably started pretty small as well. And, you know, we've evolved with really close relationships with our game developers, and, you know, we've got a big passion for making our customers successful. Like, we don't mind if you're building in Unity, we don't mind if you're building in Unreal. Like, ultimately, we want your game to succeed, and we take that at heart.
Yeah, I think that is really, I mean, especially that is even more true, or rather has to be even more true in multiplayer than in single player, because there are costs associated with using anything, and if it wasn't useful to be successful, then that would be not be quite as a positive of an experience, would it be? So
yeah,
I think on that front we are very much aligned, and it's always, if what we do, but everything we do needs to help make the user that actually wants to build a game successful, which ultimately means give a good experience to the players that they do serve, because that is the metric of success. Fantastic. Well, I mean, we have pretty much answered all the community questions that have come in as we went for now. So how about we give you another 2 minutes for any of those that would still like to squeeze in a last question about things related to BR200, Multiplay, and dedicated servers with Fusion. And then we will call it an evening, because it starts getting late over here in Europe. So is there any other thing you can already kind of maybe tease about what the community should be looking out for or looking at on the landing page of Multiplay that they might have overlooked as to move forward?
Yeah, very good question.
I mean, I know there's always so many things that it's kind of hard to see beyond the first page and go, oh, those are the 3 samples, but is there anything else we should kind of like investigate?
Yeah, I think what I'd also suggest in that is, you know, Multiplayer and Matchmaker are 2 products that work really well together. You know, hosting a dedicated server is one problem. Being able to scale those out is obviously, you know, a fantastic place to be, and you can ultimately reach your players. You can get good locality to them. But Matchmaking, you know, is the other side of that coin. You can use Multiplay in a server browser model, but if you want to try and do that en masse, it becomes pretty tricky. So I would say have one tab open on the Multiplay page, one tab open on the Matchmaker page, and read both of those docs. Get really invested in both of those samples and just see the sort of power that's those two solutions can bring together for you. And also worth saying, you don't have to use the Unity Matchmaker either. We've got a lot of customers who roll their own matchmaking solutions, so getting yourselves familiar with our REST API documentation as well would also be advisable. The whole of Multiplay is an API-driven system. So you can roll your own integrations with this. We've got future roadmaps for command line interfaces and more software development kits coming out in future. So if you'd rather not use the website, if you'd rather not use our matchmaker, it's API driven, it's all there for you to get invested in.
Everything is REST, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, all fully RESTful API.
That is true for anything that needs to get connected these days. Well, with that, thank you very much, Dan, for having joined us. It was absolutely lovely chatting with you. Jiri, as per usual, awesome insights into some things that are way above my head at times. And thank you for tuning in today. As we already said, BR200 has a multiplayer integration in it. It uses Fusion, and it is available on the Asset Store right now for free. So go check it out. It's available to anyone and everybody that wants to just take a look at how things work and how things should be done. And with this, have a good evening, a good day, depending on where you are. And most importantly, keep developing good games. See you next time.
Cheers. Bye-bye.